Welcome to Viewpoints. In this student thesis series, we're speaking with Sevan Gerard, firefighter, paramedic with LA Fire Department. Welcome, Sevan.
Hi, Heather. Thank you for having me.
Your thesis looks at identity and how that works in our very technologically diverse world. How did you come across the topic?
First of all, I've always been fascinated by technology. I tend to be an early adopter of emerging technologies, and I'm also quite interested in identity and how people interact. I grew up in a foreign country. I moved back to the United States, and have always just been fascinated by how humans interact with cultural diversity and how those factors drive how they identify themselves. And what I realized is that technology, of course, has an extremely important influence on how people not only identify themselves through their own use of technology, but also how they identify themselves and compare themselves to others in terms of the technologies that they've adopted and use.
And one of the frameworks, or one of the ways you did that in your thesis, was through the whole concept of a soldier. Can you explain that?
Traditional perspectives on identity have always focused on psychology, sociology, philosophy as well. And perspectives tend to take a systems approach. But when so many different elements come into play and interact simultaneously, emerging ideas on ecosystem perspectives have come into the picture. So I was interested in exploring what sort of ecosystems formed by sociology combined with technology. And in my research, I conducted inductive inquiry and looked for some examples that could help me build some sort of ontology or basic structure of a sociotechnical ecosystem. And I found that a soldier is a perfect example. In much of the literature from military organizations, they define the expected roles or responsibilities of the position of soldier. And I realized that this idea of position is this sort of a disembodied identity, and that as individuals enter into that position, they impart or take on a very specific identity. And if you think of it in that way, a soldier, firefighter, police officer, or any other position really is nothing more than a technological construct to attain or achieve some means into which individuals insert themselves and then bring a little bit of their own identity, but really mainly take on the identity of that position. So when I looked at this example of the soldier and the literature available on those responsibilities, I found that the commonalities are that soldiers are supposed to shoot, move, communicate, survive, and adapt. Now, of course, survival and adaptation are important characteristics or processes to maintain some sustainability over time, of course, and adapt to one's environment. But independently of those two, if you look at the ability to shoot, to move, and to communicate, shooting requires some sort of artifact. It requires a weapon. So there's some instrument or device that has to be invented and created and adapted to facilitate that process. Soldiers also have to be able to move. What's interesting is the military tends to divide itself according to its ability to move. You have one that focuses on sea, one on land, one on the air. And then, of course, communication is essential for any group to be able to coordinate and properly articulate their missions and objectives. So if you look at those three explicit responsibilities or expectations, you have some specific ideas of what technological requirements are necessary. If you continue to look at the responsibilities of a soldier or how they organize in a group, you realize that there are also some other implicit factors that come into play. For one, soldiers are part of a network structure. The military, for example, is a vertical structure where there are strong hierarchies and individuals are organized within a particular framework. There are also horizontal structures, like Anonymous, for example, which organizes itself in a very decentralized way. There are no distinct leaders, and they still can provide a coordinated effort to reach their goals. The last element that's implicit is a body of knowledge, a capacity. You can think of it a little bit as a lever. And what it does is it provides you the capacity to sort of hack or manipulate natural phenomenon. When you put those 5 dimensions together, you realize that there's a lot of interdependence between each one of those. And so groups can forego one for another, even in the pursuit of a similar outcome. So that essentially is what I use to define the dimensional boundaries of a socio-technical ecosystem.
And we talked about earlier the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda. Why is one more successful than the other using this framework?
That's a really interesting example to look at, because the way those two organizations exist in their socio-technical ecosystem, or even the way they've molded their socio-technical ecosystem, points to why ISIS rose so quickly and why Al-Qaeda really started dwindling after the capture of Osama bin Laden. So Al-Qaeda, as a bit more of a traditional terrorist organization, focused really on the network structure dimension of their ecosystem. It was a strong hierarchy, and one of the ways they enforced and influenced that dimension of their ecosystem was by recruiting individuals wherever they did, abroad or from wherever they, Pakistan, Afghanistan, where they brought them from, and then brought them to training facilities. It requires brick and mortar. Structures really are an artifact to provide shelter. So there was a strong component there on artifact. The mobility component was also very prevalent in the way they organized and conducted their activities. For example, from a counterterrorism perspective, if you require individuals to travel long distances and to come to your training facilities or training sites, and then to return back to their homes to carry out their actions, many filters can be introduced into that system through immigration, border protection, etc., to try to capture those individuals. So their ecosystem structure was really not quite as effective as ISIS was in the information age, really. What they decided to do as a group was forego a little bit of that vertical hierarchical structure, and decided to also relieve themselves of the challenges of mobility, as well as artifacts of brick and mortar training facilities, for example. And they took all of those dimensions and moved them into prioritizing communications. The reason why they could do that is because technologies like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook were available. And there's also a very large gamer community, for example, that play video games that simulate combat and warfare that are connected to the internet and form very large global networks. So they were able to tap into individuals that already had a little bit of tactical experience, even though it was completely virtual. And without requiring any of them to even leave their homes, to travel across oceans, past national borders, they were able to recruit them and then train them through YouTube, and maintain good communication with them through these internet means. That afforded them an easy army to recruit throughout the world, and they also then consequently changed the nature of the attacks they conducted. It wasn't worth pursuing long training to develop expertise in the development of improvised explosive devices, for example. Instead, they found that the psychological shock on the global audience was just as effective by grabbing a firearm and walking into a crowd and shooting individuals, or getting into a truck and just drive into a crowd, as we've seen more and more now throughout the world.
So looking at those various dimensions and specifically the framework itself, what are your recommendations in your thesis?
So there are really three interesting opportunities or realizations that come with the use of this sociotechnical ecosystem. Of course, the initial intent was to develop an analytical framework or some analytical markers that would allow for a better understanding of social identity in the efforts of counterterrorism or dealing with criminal organizations. So the first advantage or benefit of using this framework is, of course, to better understand what motivates individuals to either join a group or what maybe increases their propensity to join some criminal or terrorist organization, whether it's through their disaffection or just their own sociotechnical identity. What technologies do they like using? Does it match or pair the technologies promoted or leveraged by a group in question, which I believe increases the likelihood of specific individuals joining those groups. So there is a technological signature that we can also follow there to predict the propensity for recruitment or radicalization, for example. The other is if we understand how humans and how social groups leverage technology to achieve their goals, when we look at new and emerging technologies that were developed for a very specific purpose, we can think about how humans are going to adapt those technologies and leverage them for unintended purposes, which usually leads to unintended consequences in technological adoption. And I think the discussions we hear with drones and self-driving cars, for example, really lead to many discussions about unintended consequences. So now, if we consider these 5 dimensions, we can sort of forecast how people are going to try to manipulate the intended purposes of technology to achieve other goals. So it also offers us a little bit of insight into the potential unintended consequences. And I think the last and perhaps most important component of this framework is the realization that technology can be engineered to influence identity. And this, of course, has some benefits, and it has some extremely dangerous side effects as well. One of the dangers is regulation, let's say, of information freedom on the internet or online in order to control groups that favor free speech, like Anonymous, for example. One of the dangers, I think, is in trying to control a group like Anonymous because of some undesirable acts that they conduct, by limiting their access or their ability to communicate freely. By manipulating that technology, you're really influencing the group and forcing them to adapt and find new methods of circumventing those regulations. So we don't want to control the wrong dimensions of a technological ecosystem because we'll always end up with
something new to fight.
Yeah, adaptation and something new to fight. We have to think about how we influence technology from a policy level, for example, so that we don't end up making the situation worse and then force an organization to adopt more of a criminal approach.
Mm. So if you had one more chapter to write in your thesis, what would it cover?
So in this thesis, I took a sociological perspective. I'm really interested in how technology also influences the individual. And so in my research, I started looking a little bit at Maslow's hierarchy. And what's interesting is later on in Maslow's life, he started writing a lot about this idea of self-transcendence. Maslow himself in his journals wrote that he struggled with creating some sort of neat organizational system to complement his famous pyramid or hierarchy with this idea of self-transcendence. He didn't know if it went above self-actualization or if it somehow fit somewhere within that framework. And while I was doing that research, which I ended up leaving out to really focus on the sociological implications, I realized that this idea of self-transcendence is very relevant to every layer of the hierarchy, and that perhaps one of our motivations for innovating and developing technologies is to help us accomplish all the prerequisites from each level to move to the next one. And so I think I would be interested in looking at that in terms of developing a better understanding of why we then in turn sociologically pursue innovation, and how those sometimes are not in the best interest of the individual, but in the best interest of the group. Those distinctions between individual identity, an individual technical or technological identity, and sociotechnical identity are really interesting to me.
Well, it's truly a fascinating subject, and one we wish you could cover more and do another thesis on. But for now, we'll settle for reading your thesis. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Heather.